Welcome back. I'm Ian Masters, and this is Background Briefing, available 24/7 at backgroundbriefing.org. And joining us now is Naomi Oreskes, who is a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. She received the Young Investigators Award from the National Science Foundation, served as a consultant to the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and was a consultant to the United States Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. Her books include Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming, and Why Trust Science. Her latest book, Just Out, co-authored with Eric Conway, is The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. Welcome to Background Briefing, Naomi Oreskes.
Thank you. It's nice to be back with you, Ian.
Well, thanks for joining us, Naomi. And we have an example of the failure of American capitalism at the moment with the toxic spill in Ohio from the derailment. It is obvious that Norfolk Southern and its executives are not railway people. They're not invested in the rail business. They don't listen to their workers. In fact, they've suppressed a recent strike and have cut the workforce down to a point where it's incredibly dangerous. We have 1,000 derailments a year, and this is all being driven by Wall Street. And Wall Street nowadays seems to be more about extracting wealth as opposed to creating wealth. So just to start with a context here, do you think that American capitalism, in a sense, is in a crisis?
Yes, I do. I think the very fact that we're having this conversation shows that the extreme deregulatory ideology that has dominated for the past 40 years and whose origins we explain in our new book has really had a terrible effect on the American economy and American life. This most recent example, the train derailment, is a perfect example of what in the book we call the high cost of the free market. We've been bombarded with propaganda and ideology telling us that we should just trust the business community, let the market do its magic, and this will generate prosperity and all will be well. But what we've seen is that it's not true. It does generate prosperity up to a point, but it also generates huge external costs. And this latest train derailment and all the damage, all the environmental damage, the health damage, is a very clear example of how much it costs when we don't take the time to regulate markets properly.
So your book really, in many ways, explains the way that Americans have become alienated from their own government. And it's sort of the opposite in a way of social democracy, where people vote for politicians who deliver government services. Here we've been consistently distracted by other issues like guns and prayer in school, etc. So the functioning of government is not understood in this country, and therefore people don't have a stake in it because they don't feel it delivers. But the reason it doesn't deliver is that they're not engaged. So it's a vicious cycle, is it not? But it's obviously encouraged by the oligarchs, the people like the Koch brothers, who may not have captured the country entirely, but they've certainly captured the Supreme Court.
Yes, exactly. And this is really the whole point of the book, is to explain how we came to this state of affairs. Because as much as I'm no fan of the Koch brothers, this story actually begins a long time before them. And it involves a much more complicated network of American business that includes trade organizations going back to the very early part of the 20th century. And what we show in the book is that these business folks have been involved in a really longue durée campaign to make us distrust our own government, as you just put it perfectly, to alienate us from our own government and to forget that government is us, that this is our government created by the founding fathers to represent the will of the people and not the will of a monarch, or in this case, an oligarch. And so what we show in the book is how this was done systematically in a very sort of astonishingly organized and thought out way to propagandize the American people through radio, through television, through film, through children's books, through academia, to make us think that the government was our enemy rather than an instrument of our own will.
And of course, they had setbacks early on with the Depression, right?
Exactly. A big part of this story takes place in the Great Depression, when American business was trying to claim that the enemy of the people was not big business, but big government. But that argument rang pretty hollow when American capitalism was more or less in free fall. when 25% of the American workforce was out of work through no fault of their own, and when able-bodied men and women had been thrown out of work and onto breadlines. And so the business community realized that most people weren't going to fall for their arguments, that this was really a rather transparent attempt to protect the prerogatives and profits of big business. And so what did they do? They had to find a way to make this argument seem credible. And they did it by linking it to freedom, by claiming that if we allowed the government to become involved in the marketplace, whether it was limiting child labor or better regulating dangerous industries like the railroads. And the railroads are a really big part of this story. So it's very ironic, but in a way appropriate, that we're looking at yet again a deadly accident involving railroads. So they linked it to freedom, that we would lose our freedom. And they launched this propaganda campaign called the Tripod of Freedom, claiming that free enterprise was foundational to American democracy, something that was really a pure invention. I mean, free enterprise doesn't appear anywhere in the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, but by linking it to freedom, they thought they could get Americans on board. And there's a very telling document we found where one official at the National Association of Manufacturers, who are a key player in the story, say, look, we're not getting it through to the American people, in part because they realize that this argument doesn't really hold water. So we have to link it to something that Americans hold dear, and that something is freedom. And in Merchants of Doubt, we showed how that exact same argument had been used in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s by the tobacco industry. And so what now we find is we can push that argument back even further to the 1930s.
But ironically, we have reached a point now in America where freedom threatens life and liberty.
Well, exactly. And of course, this is a big point of the conclusion of the book, that these arguments are really arguments about competing freedoms. It's always been the case, and it's long been recognized, going back to the Old Testament, the way Isaiah Berlin put it, that freedom for wolves can mean death for lambs. We all have things we want to do, but that we don't do, either because our conscience tells us it's wrong or because the law forbids it, because if we exercise our freedom to do X, we will hurt or damage someone else in the process. So we're not free to dump garbage on someone else's lawn, and yet somehow industry is free to dump carbon pollution into the atmosphere. And so why do we allow the second and not the first? Well, in part because big business, American business and industry, has tried to persuade us that if we control pollution, that somehow we'll lose our freedoms. But really, we lose our freedom, we lose our health, we lose our well-being, we lose our prosperity when we allow businesses to dump carbon pollution into the atmosphere and other kinds of things which really hurt the American people.
So just to move on from the Depression, of course, arguably the Depression ended with World War II and the massive arsenal of democracy and the ultimate victory of the Allies. And then in the post-war period, we had the GI Bill, which was one of probably the best government programs of all time in a way. It was so visionary, where it created a middle class because they couldn't put all those men back to work that were being demobilized. So they gave them an education. And it's an example of a great American program. And then in the late 40s in Hollywood, you had the sort of film noir period, which reflected the mood of the country and the men that had fought in the war, who had seen terrible things, and the Holocaust was exposed. And then the American Chamber of Commerce and the National Association of Manufacturers didn't like films like The Grapes of Wrath. So then began this House of Un-American Activities, and one of their shills and frontmen was none other than Ronald Reagan. And of course, Ayn Rand, a failed screenwriter, was also in there, starting this war against the woke, I guess, in Hollywood back in the 1940s. It's finally, you know, in a way, your book has crystallized my understanding, because I'm here in Hollywood, and I knew personally my sister was married to the son of one of the Hollywood 10, so I know that period pretty well. So let's talk about that, how they changed the kind of national narrative through entertainment to be more pro-business and less skeptical.
Propaganda is fundamentally about storytelling. It's about trying to tell a story that is persuasive to people. So it was only a matter of time before the National Association of Manufacturers and the US Chamber of Commerce would realize that they needed to mobilize Hollywood. And so in the book, we have a chapter that specifically looks at how they did that. In the 1930s, as you just said, in the early 40s, there were a lot of films that looked critically at American capitalism, that looked at the roots of the Great Depression. Grapes of Wrath looked at police violence against workers and ordinary people. But Hollywood in the 1950s turns against that. And there's this great speech we discovered where Eric Johnston, the president of the Motion Pictures Association of America, who had previously come out of the US Chamber of Commerce and had also been linked with a right-wing Christian movement called Spiritual Mobilization, makes a speech in which he declares there'll be no more grapes of wrath. And so Hollywood begins to develop censorship codes. And today we often think about censorship as being about sex, or, well, mostly about sex and nudity. But this censorship code was about the portrayal of capitalism. And the idea was that Hollywood should make films that portrayed American capitalism in a good light, that did not criticize the wealthy, that did not suggest that maybe the wealthy had got their wealth through untoward means, that didn't criticize bankers. And one of the astonishing things we found in this, doing this research, was who was the author of those censorship codes? It was Ayn Rand, the same libertarian philosopher who in her own work is espousing a philosophy of radical individual freedom, is working to deny freedom to screenwriters and directors and producers in Hollywood.
And she ended up on Social Security, right?
I don't even know, but I don't doubt it. I don't doubt it.
Right.
I mean, the hypocrisy of so many of these people who accept government largesse when it works for them and criticize it when it doesn't is pretty darn obvious.
Well, it's happening now with Republican congressmen and senators taking credit for the infrastructure bill that's pouring money into their districts,
and even
which they all voted against.
I know, even more egregious and more deeply, deeply morally offensive if you listen to Sarah Huckabee Sanders' response to the State of the Union address. She took credit for the protection of the Little Rock Nine, the Black teenagers who fought for their freedom to go to school. The Little Rock Nine were defended by the federal government. It was the federal government that defended the freedom of those young people, not the state of Arkansas. The state of Arkansas, the governor tried to do everything he could to stop those young people from going to school. So there's tremendous amounts of revisionist history that take place. And we show that in the book as well, that the whole story of the tripod of freedom, the idea of big business as protector of American freedom is completely fabricated. I mean, it's just not even close to what actually has happened in American history.
So let's talk for a minute, Naomi Oreskes, about Christian individualism, which morphed into Christian libertarianism and its influence in terms of market fundamentalism.
So one of the most interesting things about this story is to see what people do when they are faced with facts that don't fit their ideology, what Al Gore famously called inconvenient truths. And so one of the most interesting of those involves Protestants in America in the 1930s. So in the 1930s, many mainline Protestants, many influential Protestant leaders felt that capitalism was really rather unchristian, that the idea that you just be left to fend for yourself or left to rely on private charity was unchristian. I mean, after all, think about it. The message of Jesus is a message of caring for and loving the poor. And so there were Protestant leaders in the 30s who argued that the government did have to do more to help people who were suffering during the Great Depression. This was a giant problem for the captains of industry who wanted to argue that the government should just stay out of the way and let business run things. So a group of business leaders led by J. Howard Pugh, the president of Sun Oil Company, later known as Sunoco, and also a leader in the American Association of Manufacturers, decides to fund an organization specifically designed to try to align American Christians with free market capitalism. It's called Spiritual Mobilization, and some of the things they did were truly amazing. So they created magazines with names like Christian Economics. They worked with people at seminaries to alter the syllabi in the training programs in seminaries to make the training more pro-capitalist, more pro-wealthy, to present wealthy people as people who had succeeded because of their dint of hard work, rather than the idea that they might have perhaps exploited laborers. And they funded pro-capitalist ministers, the two most famous being Billy Graham, who we know was highly influential, influenced Richard Nixon, and Norman Vincent Peale. Fun fact that we discovered in this. So Norman Vincent Peale, who's being funded by these right-wing pro-capitalist business executives, captains of industry, two of his parishioners were Mary and Fred Trump, and Norman Vincent Peale officiated at the first wedding of Donald Trump.
And
Yeah.
and of course, economics itself, Adam Smith being one of the founding fathers, I guess. The moral component of economics, of course, was lost over the ages as well. That you chronicle, Adam Smith concluded that when regulation, therefore, is in favor of the workman, it is always just and equitable, but it is sometimes otherwise when in favor of the masters. So let's talk a little about, we talked about Ronald Reagan's role in the House of Un-American Activities, but then he pops up again as President of the United States and makes his big inaugural speech, government is the problem, not the answer. That obviously had and he had his kitchen cabinet and etc. That had a really detrimental effect. One of the things that I think is often overlooked is that prior to Ronald Reagan, the U.S. had a savings economy where people saved money, and wages have been flat since Reagan. They haven't gone up. But one of the ways that they've compensated for the lack of a raise in wages is that under Reagan, they introduced credit, which gives people the illusion that their standard of living is being maintained, but they in fact become indentured. And the bank borrows money from the Fed at 2% and lends it back at 18.5%. And that has changed the nature of our life. So many people live on credit and are indentured.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in that comment. So let me just pick up on two themes that you raised. One is academia and the other is Ronald Reagan, and they're, of course, interrelated. So one of the important things we discuss in the book is the way these captains of industry also tried to influence academia. So everyone knows about the University of Chicago, the Chicago School of Economics, and many of us might think that those people came to prominence through open competition in the marketplace of ideas. That thought would be mistaken. What we show in the book was that a group of industrialists, again, linked to these same organizations we've been talking about, in this case, particularly an industrialist called Jasper Crane, who had been an executive at the DuPont Corporation, consciously funded pro-market, anti-regulation economists at the Chicago School and helped to make the Chicago School into what it famously later became. And one of the people they funded was the economist George Stigler. George Stigler won the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics. He's a very famous name in economics. He published an edited version of Adam Smith. So many of us think of Adam Smith as the father of capitalism, the father of laissez-faire, a person who was opposed to government intervention in the marketplace. That is untrue. In fact, The Wealth of Nations has an extensive discussion, as you said, about the rights of workers, about the need for workers to be paid a decent wage, about the appropriateness of workers banding together in what today we would call unions because of the power imbalance between managers and workers. And he also has an extremely thoughtful and extensive discussion of the need for regulation of banks and how banks actually threaten to bring down the entire economy if you don't properly regulate them. Most of us have no idea that Adam Smith said these things. And why is that? Well, one reason is because Stigler's version of The Wealth of Nations, which was published by a leading publisher and widely distributed, expunged all of the places in The Wealth of Nations where Smith discusses the need for regulation, the need for what today we would call unions. And so he presents a version of Adam Smith, which is really a misrepresentation of the nuance and the subtlety of Smith's views. But that's the Adam Smith that most of us have been exposed to. One of the people who was exposed to this Chicago school way of thinking was Ronald Reagan. And so another important part of the story, and this is sort of the whole third of the book, is how did these ideas go mainstream? Because they're being perpetuated, they're being funded, they're being cultivated by captains of industry who really do not represent the views of the American people. And public opinion polls consistently show that most Americans do want the government to protect workers, to protect the environment, to regulate unscrupulous business practices and even to protect capitalism itself against monopoly. So how do these folks finally win the day? Well, a big part of the answer to that question is through Ronald Reagan. Most Americans know that before he was president of the United States, Ronald Reagan was an actor. What they don't know is that the transition that he went through from a pro-union, democratic New Deal actor to an anti-government, anti-union Republican politician took place at the General Electric Corporation. Reagan spent most of the late 1950s working for GE, where he did two things. He hosted a television program called General Electric Theater that was very, very popular. And so he became known to millions and millions of Americans as the host of this television program, which promoted didactic stories of individual initiative and stories that argued we didn't need the government, we could just stand on our own 2 feet. But he also went on the lecture circuit on behalf of General Electric, promoting GE's anti-union, anti-government ideology. He also was given reading lists by GE executives of things he needed to read, which included foundational texts of neoliberal Austrian economics, etc. When he leaves GE, he leaves with a completely different ideology than he went in. He has a set of speeches that he has cultivated and honed working for General Electric, and he leaves with a set of powerful backers in corporate America who finance his run for political office, first as governor of California, and then later to run for president of the United States.
So, Naomi Oreskes, just in the last minute then, freedom has to be recaptured. It's been appropriated and abused. And as I mentioned earlier, we are reaching a point in this country where freedom threatens life and liberty. You know, you're free to have a gun, but you're not free to go to a mall or a theater or a church without the possibility of being shot by some madman with a military-style weapon. So just in the last minute, let's talk a little bit about how, I mean, who can do it? The Democratic Party, the American people? They've got to reclaim freedom.
Absolutely. And if we were on television, I would be wearing my American flag pin. I think progressives and liberals have made a big mistake by allowing the right wing to capture the ideology of freedom. Freedom, as you say, is a really complex notion. Philosophers since Plato have worried about competing freedoms and how we find the right balance. And I think it's pretty clear that in the United States today, we do not have the right balance. As you said, millions of people, there are hundreds of millions of guns in this country. People have the freedom to own guns, but I don't have the freedom to go to the mall or to a concert or even to send my children to school without having worried that they will be shot by a madman. So we need to have a different kind of conversation. And the whole point of this book really is to try to open up the opportunities for that kind of conversation, which you've helped us to do here today.
Well, Naomi Oreskes, I thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you.
And again, I've been speaking with Naomi Oreskes, who's a professor of the history of science and affiliated professor of earth and planetary sciences at Harvard University. She received the Young Investigators Award from the National Science Foundation, served as a consultant to the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and was a consultant to the U.S. Nuclear Waste Technical Review Board. Her books include Merchants of Doubt, How a Handful of Scientists Obscured the Truth on Issues from Tobacco Smoke to Global Warming, and Why Trust Science. And her latest book, just out, co-authored with Eric Conway, is The Big Myth, How American Business Taught Us to Loathe Government and Love the Free Market. This has been Background Briefing. I'm Ian Masters, and I'd like to thank producer Graham Fitzgibbon. And to help us sustain this program into the future and assure it remains free to all, please take a moment to support us by going to backgroundbriefing.org/donate or publictruthmedia.org, where you will find our non-profit Public Truth Media Foundation, where your tax-deductible donations, large and small, keep us broadcasting. And if you missed any of today's program and would like to explore our vast archives, you can find us at backgroundbriefing.org, where we'll include extended interviews searchable by topic, and have made it easy for you to sign up for daily email updates that provide links to resources, articles, and books discussed on the program. Also, you can find links there to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and we also encourage your ratings and reviews on these platforms. Find us on Twitter and Facebook at Ian Masters Media, and please do help us reach more listeners by sharing this program with friends, family, and colleagues. And I'll be back again tomorrow with another background briefing at backgroundbriefing.org. Bye for now.
The guy that lived next door in 305 took the kids to the park and disappeared by half